Okay.
Okay, we're recording. Just like to introduce for our second keynote today, Eve Delunas, and Pitfalls and Pathways to Spiritual Growth for the Four Temperaments. Thank you, Eve.
Thank you, Richard. And thank you to all of you who organized the conference. You've done such a fantastic job. It's really been amazing how well organized everything is and smoothly everything is going. So thank you for allowing me to be a part of this. So today I will be talking about spiritual growth, and I'm going to be first discussing briefly, very briefly, what is spiritual growth, and then going on to talk about your ego versus your essence and the pitfalls and pathways for each of the four temperaments. And then we're going to end with a very small group exercise. So that's where we're headed. And let's start by talking about what is spiritual growth. Are you seeing this that covers up my slide? You probably are, aren't you? Are you seeing the photos, folks? Everybody's pictures covering up my slide? I never know what you see.
No, just the slides we've seen.
Oh, you're only seeing the slide. Okay, great. So I can still see your photos, because I'd rather see you than just my slide. All right. So we're talking here about moving from ego to essence. That's going to be my focus here. Now, I understand that no doubt if I interviewed each and every one of you, we would have that many different definitions of spiritual growth. So I'm not saying this is the only definition of spiritual growth, but for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to focus on the aspect of spiritual growth that involves moving beyond our egos into a place of essence. So what is essence? Well, there are as many terms to refer to essence as there are those of us present as well, I'm sure. But a few common ways of thinking of essence is it's pure awareness. It's the real you, a state of presence. It's your greater self or your higher self. It is the witness. It's your pure consciousness that is present right now, and perhaps witnessing your thoughts that you're having about the things that you're seeing or hearing. So those are some ways. It's higher wisdom, it's universal love, it's associated essence is when we're in our essence, when we're acting from essence, when we're coming from essence. Those are all ways we talk about it, but language doesn't really do it justice because it goes beyond the language that we use. When we are, then we are in a state of balance and a state of harmony, of well-being. You can also call it source energy. You don't have to have a religious belief in order to recognize essence, but those who are more religious might call it the God self, the divine self, the spark of divinity within, a state of oneness with all that is. So those are some ways of thinking about essence. And I'm suggesting that spiritual growth is moving more and more often into this state of essence in your life. Now, where are we moving from? We're moving from that marvelous ego that each of us is blessed with as part of our humanity. And our ego is a part of us that creates stories about us, stories about who you are. Okay, who am I? I am a type coach, or I am a consultant, or I am a mother or a father or a daughter or a son or a parent. And so the ego is all about finding these ways. I am the owner of this kind of car, or I live in this kind of house or this kind of neighborhood, or I am British, or I am American, or I am some Canadian, or I am Australian, or I am something else. So that's where the ego is coming from. And the ego you can think of as the little you. It's not very present, whereas essence is you being very present in your life, the ego is associated with not being very present. Really, when we're in ego, we're pretty unconscious. And we're going to talk more about how that works in a few minutes. And the ego is the voice in your head. And most of us have egos that are pretty active most of the time in our heads, like lots of commentary about labeling things, judgments, what we're seeing, what we're hearing, criticizing ourselves, criticizing and judging others. Our egos have lots of opinions about things. That's one way it has a sense of identity. My sense of identity is someone who believes this is true and that's false. Ego gets off on really having strong opinions usually, and our egos can keep us very busy with their constant chatter. So I have a question for you, and Richard's going to help me with this. The first question: which of the following is not true of the ego? Its goal is to keep us physically and emotionally safe. It operates out of early conditioning, often holding false beliefs. It frees us from suffering. Or is it runs the show as our default mode, which is not true? Don't forget to mute yourselves. Okay. Has everybody made their selection? Richard, can we see the results, please? All right. So interesting. It frees us from suffering. 86% of you said it frees us from suffering. And that was, you said that it is untrue. And that is absolutely correct. It frees us from suffering is not true. As a matter of fact, the opposite is true. It creates suffering. Marianne, it looks like you're not muted. Could you mute yourself, please?
It says mute on my screen.
Oh, does it? Oh.
Yes, it does.
Oh, but I hear you. Okay. I don't understand. Okay. Anyway, so exactly, you're right on target there. Those of you that said it doesn't, basically you're saying it does not free us from suffering. So it is true that it tries to keep us physically and emotionally safe. That's what the ego believes its job is, to keep us physically and emotionally safe. And so how does it do that? Operating with a lot of fear, a lot of reminding us to not step out of our comfort zones too far, reminding us of things that could happen that are not so pleasant if we try to do this or that or something else. It tries to keep us physically and emotionally safe in lots of different ways. Our egos are very creative with that. So it's coming from a really wonderful place. Its goal is doing something that's going to help us. It operates also out of early conditioning. It's as we're younger and we were growing up, the ego found ways of seeing the world, develop ways of seeing the world based on limited perspectives we have before the age of 6, develop these early belief systems, and then they get stored in our hippocampus. We're not even aware that they're there because they're there as what we call implicit memory. And then we act out of these as if they're the truth about ourselves and the world. So we develop beliefs like, I'm not good enough, other people can't be trusted, I don't deserve to be happy, I'm not as good as other people. If I allow others to get close to me, they will abandon me. people will always disappoint me. There's never enough money. I mean, it's an enormous range of things that we decide, but we decide these things based on the perspective of a 3-year-old or 4-year-old or 5-year-old witnessing if the way the world is around them, how they're being treated, and coming to these conclusions, usually very false conclusions. And then the ego acts as if those are true for the rest of our lives. And of course, if you believe I am going to be abandoned if I let people come close, if that's the ego's perspective, it's going to do everything it can to keep you from allowing someone to get close to you, for example. And then it is the default mode. Unless we do something to take its power away, the ego does run the show most of the time. And so what ends up happening is we suffer more as opposed to less when we are under the control of our ego. And as human beings, most of us are under the control of our ego a very, very good part of the time. That's a very common thing. And it's not a terrible thing. It's just something we have to know, and we may or may not choose to deal with in a variety of different ways. So thank you. Let's go on. And so what happens when we align with our essence? Well, when we are aligned with our essence, wonderful things happen. We tend to experience a lot more peace and joy. We become more creative. We experience more well-being in our lives, in our physical selves. Not that you can be aligned with your essence and still have physical disabilities and physical challenges, most certainly. But in general, things in our lives improve when we align with our essence. Our mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual state of being is more in balance and in harmony with our highest good. So it's something that we often desire to do. So how do we go about doing that? Well, let's look here. Well, one way is to have a better understanding of what it's like when we're coming from the ego versus what it's like when we're coming from fear. It's important to do that because the ego is pretty tricky. The ego likes to hide to prevent us from realizing that it's running the show. It knows, your ego knows you really well, so it knows what to say and do in order to maintain control. It knows what's going to scare you the most. And so those are typically the kinds of messages you're going to get from your ego so that the ego maintains its power and its control. It hides in a variety of ways. But if you are aware that when you're feeling fearful, chances are, unless you're fearful because you're at the top of a fjord in Norway looking down and you'd rather not step any farther towards that cliff, chances are the kinds of fears the ego produces are pretty everyday fears. It may be the ego that's operating. If you're feeling a sense, if you're judging yourself, the ego loves to judge the self or other people or situations. Judgment is generally something that comes from the ego. Now, I'm not talking about the kind of judging that is associated with the judging preference. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about being judgmental versus if you're in a place of peace and appreciation, you're more in alignment with your essence, because the appreciation is, in fact, one of the things. Gratitude, appreciation is something that can put you, connect you with your essence more quickly than almost anything. It's a very, very powerful way to get in touch with your essence. If you're struggling, that's a sign of the ego. Ease is more a sign of essence. If you're ruminating about the past or future, it's ego. If you're more focused on the now. That's essence. It doesn't mean if you're planning for the future, doing some, realistic planning, or if you're thinking about something wonderful that happened in the past, that's not necessarily ego. But ego is ruminating about what you did wrong in the past, what you should feel guilty about or ashamed about. Shoulda, coulda, wouldas is usually the past, or the ego's having catastrophic thoughts about the future. What if kind of thinking, what if this terrible thing happens? What if this doesn't happen? That's more coming from our ego. When we're in resistance, when we're saying, no, it's not okay that there's this traffic jam, that shouldn't be, it's not okay. What's wrong with this world? You are in ego. When you're in this acceptance, saying, I'm not crazy about what's happening in my life right now, but hey, I need to accept it in order to then decide what kind of action I can take best to deal with it. If you're focused on what's wrong with yourself, what's wrong with your life, what's wrong with other people, what's wrong with the situation, that typically is the ego. And if you're focused on what's right, that's typically more coming from the essence. It could be now and then coming from the ego. If you start to train your ego to look a little more at what's going right in your world, what's right about you, what's right about other people. And the ego gives you a sense of constriction as opposed to a feeling of expansion. Now, as I talk about this, my guess is that your egos are going to be, some of you are going to find your egos are pretty active, and it might be an interesting time just to ask yourself, what's my ego doing right now? Is your ego telling you that this is boring and a waste of time and you really don't need to be here? And it may be boring and a waste of time for you, who knows, but that could also be your ego just trying to get you not to think about these things. Is your ego telling you you're sleepy? Is your ego focused on what you're going to have for dinner? Is your ego focused on, I know some people that are just like this, yeah. Or is your ego beating up on you for identifying with some of this? I'm wondering if you could have a show of hands, if any of you relate to any of the things I just mentioned that your ego might be doing. Can we do a show of hands, Richard? Is there a way of doing that?
There's usually, if you go to the participant screen, they might find there's a way to raise hand in that.
Oh yeah, okay. There it is, yes. Yeah, I'm curious, raise your hand if you've observed your ego during this presentation so far, doing any of the above. Might be interesting just to notice that. And it might not, absolutely might not. But I'm going down the list and I'm seeing a few of you for sure. Who are saying, yeah, my ego's kind of doing one of the following. Now, let's go on and do another poll.
Okay.
So number 2 poll, Richard, please. Thanks. So true or false? The goal of spiritual growth is to eliminate the ego and operate from essence all the time. So can we see?
Yeah, got 2% of votes in. Do you want to end it now?
Oh, there aren't a big percentage of votes in yet?
A few more coming in. Last few seconds to vote if you want to do it now.
Yeah.
Use true or false. Okay. I'm going to end it now.
Yeah. All right. Yes, exactly. 91% of you said it's false, and that is false because we're never going to eliminate our egos. They're a part of being human. They don't ever go away. And the goal isn't to operate out of essence all the time. There might be a few ascended masters that are able to do that, but most of us aren't. But the goal is to spend more of our time operating out of essence. Okay, so let's go on to the next poll. I have another question for you. Poll number 3. So, which is true? You can disempower your ego and align with your essence by turning off your mental chatter, witnessing your ego with curiosity and non-judgment, criticizing yourself gently for letting your ego control you. Which of those is true?
Okay, we've had 82% voted. What about 5 to 10 more seconds?
Yeah.
Use your votes. Yeah, 88. Getting there now. Okay, I'm going to end the vote polling now.
Okay. How did you do? Yes, you guys know all the answers here. It is indeed, you can disempower your ego and align with your essence by witnessing your ego with curiosity and non-judgment. Exactly, because as you witness it, then you are with essence. You are in essence, actually, because you witness any part of you, your thoughts and your feelings, from a place of essence. You're in your greater consciousness. And if you do so with curiosity and non-judgment, it disempowers the ego. What you don't want to do is criticize yourself. And this is a really tough one, because the ego, there's a writer, and I love his metaphor for the ego. And he says the ego is like a crazy roommate, or can be like a crazy roommate. So the ego is the one that says to us, you're really fat and you really need to lose weight, so you better stop eating chocolate. But the ego then is the one that says to us, when we see a piece of chocolate, you know, it really wouldn't hurt if you ate that piece of chocolate. It's probably delicious. And, you know, I mean, stop eating chocolate tomorrow. Enjoy today, live for today. So you eat the chocolate, and then your ego is the one that says, see, you have no self-control. You're just absolutely out of control. You're going to end up gaining 50 pounds rather than losing weight like you really need to. What is wrong with you? And imagine having a roommate that said all of that to you. It would be a crazy roommate. And yet that's what lives in a lot of our heads, that kind of roommate. Now, I noticed somebody asked the question, is there a healthy ego? There is. What you can do as you get more into essence, as you witness your ego more and more, you can disempower it and therefore train your ego to be more helpful to you in the ways that you desire from the big picture of your life, rather than being so, in some cases, self-sabotaging, self-destructive, or just creating suffering for you, because it's not pleasant to have this crazy roommate telling you these things. And it creates a sense of, oh my goodness, you know, hopelessness, and makes one doubt oneself, and what one is capable of doing. All right, so let's have one more poll. The best way to know if you're operating out of ego or essence is to notice how you feel. True or false? Okay. Richard, do we have enough votes in?
Sorry, up to 90%. Another 3 seconds. Last chance to vote. True or false? Okay, I'm ending it now. I'll share the results.
All right. Yes, it is true. The best way to know if you're operating out of ego or essence is to notice how you feel. Harking back to that little chart I gave you earlier, if you're feeling some of those things on the left side of the chart that we associate with ego, it's time to ask yourself some questions. And that's a clue that you're probably coming more from ego than you are from essence. So now I want to move on and talk about the four temperaments, because I've been working with people on and using type and temperament now for 50 years. That's a long time. And it's been a wonderful gift in my life to have this view of being able to understand people's differences. But whenever I'm learning something new, as I'm sure many of you do, I start to look at what I'm learning through the lens of temperament or type, and the 16 types often. And I start to say, well, does this seem more applicable to some than others? So what I'm going to share with you are the ways that I think that the catalysts most often get tripped up in their desire to move from ego to essence, and similarly with the people with the stabilizer preference or the theorist preference or the improviser preference. Now, I'm not saying that if I list something for a catalyst that someone who has a theorist preference might not engage in that same behavior. They might. I can't say it's exclusively those with the catalyst preference or the stabilizer preference or any of them. I'm saying these are patterns I see. These are tendencies I've seen in my work with coaching clients, psychotherapy clients, workshop participants, students, etc. These are some of the themes I've seen, but I'm not saying they're exclusive. Because I think that some of us dip into a lot of these different areas. And I'm going to give you what I think are some of the most common things that I see. And also some of the things that I list are perhaps going to be a little more common with certain of the four subtypes of each catalyst, of each temperament, than with others of the subtypes. So here we go. Let's start with the catalyst. I thought I'd start with catalyst because I thought probably going to be more catalysts at this presentation than other temperaments. So I thought I'd start with you folks. And I think that I tried to think of or list 3 pitfalls for each of the preferences. And I think the NF preference is very prone to spiritual bypass. And it has to do with their all or none thinking. It's likely to be the catalyst who, when they try to grow spiritually, kind of put on those rose-colored glasses and skip over all of the dark and dirty stuff that they don't want to look at inside. Not that any of the other preferences loves looking at their shadow side, but catalysts are particularly good at pretending to themselves and everybody else that shadow side doesn't exist at all. And we call it a spiritual bypass because it's like they go up from here, I'm just going to go right over here because I don't have any bad feelings. I don't have any anger from the past. I don't have any shame. I don't have any guilt or any of that, because if I'm going to be a really spiritual person, and this all or none thinking is involved, of course, I am like, I can't have any of that. I need to be all loving all the time. I need to be all forgiving all the time. I need to be all patient and kind all the time, all authentic all the time. Of course, this is totally not authentic. So they tend to do this complete denial and repression of, and skipping over and completely ignoring some of the things that are really prevalent in their shadow that really need to be addressed. Part of moving from the ego to the essence is addressing exactly what's in our shadow that we don't want to look at. Because one of the reasons the ego tries so hard to protect us, it's trying to protect us from feeling some of the feelings that we have in our shadow that are really painful. And so the more we deal with those feelings, the less the ego has to do, because we are not giving it such a difficult job. So those are some of the pitfalls. And the catalyst tends to have a hard time being grounded in practical reality sometimes when they're into something that they're wanting to achieve. And so the catalyst might be the one who says, you know, if I'm going to really grow spiritually, the only way I can do that is if I sell everything I own and move to India, you know, that kind of thing, which, I mean, that's fine if somebody wants to do that. And that might be the answer for certain people. But sometimes the NF preference person doesn't think things through very clearly in practical reality. So those are some things that I've observed with NFs that can be pitfalls for their moving forward. It actually keeps them more stuck than to deny practical reality or deny, I mean, by deny, it's beyond deny. They don't even know it's there anymore. When it comes to their spiritual bypass, they repress. So it's to be so out of touch with the things in their shadow, the thoughts, the feelings, the experiences, the dark side of themselves. And of course, whatever we resist, whatever we deny inside of ourselves is going to run us ultimately from our shadow, as Jung told us. So let's look at some of the pathways for this particular temperament. And by pathways, I mean, you know, what are some strengths that they have that they can call upon in moving forward? And I see, you know, NF preference people as being really determined inner seekers. They want to know themselves. They pursue self-knowledge, self-growth, self-awareness, like a thirsty person pursues water. They are they're drawn to that kind of work, and they're very fluent with dreams and symbols and imagery, and all of those can be very helpful in exploring and getting to know the self, both the ego self and the essence self. And they tend to be natural empathizers and naturally have much compassion for other people. And embodying empathy and compassion is another part of the pathway towards essence. It's really seeing all of us as one in the world. And I think NFs long to and try to see oneness, and teach so many NF preference people, catalysts teach temperament, I think, and utilize it because it's a pathway towards oneness for humanity, for recognizing we're all one, although we have these differences, we're all one in at heart. So those are some things that I think are strengths for the NF. And I want to give you some references, helpful resources. Now, it's not just the catalysts that could benefit from these, as for the other references that I'm going to give you for the other resources for the other temperaments. Debbie Ford's book, The Dark Side of Light Chasers, is wonderful for, I think it's aptly named for catalysts. And it's wonderful for really getting in touch with your shadow side in a loving way. And of course, when we do get in touch with our shadow side, or when we get in touch with that ego and really identify it, we want to be loving. If we're judging ourselves, if we're putting ourselves down, if we're criticizing, if we're really harsh with ourselves, that's just that's the ego. We're just back in the ego, doing more of the same. So it's when we can love our dark side that we can heal it. And Debbie Ford's book is really good about doing that. Sanaya Roman's books are about using guided meditations to grow spiritually. And I love her books. They're wonderful spiritual growth oriented books, and her guided meditations are quite wonderful also. And NF preference people often love guided meditations, and they come very naturally by using those kinds of tools. And then journaling and dream interpretation is also something that I find that catalysts love, and can really get into and can be very helpful along their paths, their journeys. But of course, these things can also be useful for other temperaments as well. And a lovely quote from Carolyn Mace: the soul always knows what it needs to do to heal itself. The challenge is to silence the mind. I love that quote. So that's what we're aiming for here. Carolyn Mace also, I think, probably has a preference, I suspect, for a catalyst, but don't know that for sure. All right, and then stabilizers. I thought stabilizers would be the next largest group here. And what are their pitfalls? Stabilizers, I found, by and large, have real trouble with their egos dwelling on the past or catastrophizing about the future. And this is one of their biggest challenges very often. Stabilizer preference people find that their egos go again and again and again to way beyond the present in the past. I mean, I have had stabilizers come to me as clients who are absolutely unable to let go of things that they've done in the past that they believe were wrong or bad, or forgive themselves or forgive other people, things that happened 20 and 30 and 40 years ago. They're still holding on to and thinking about every day, dwelling on every day. Now, not everyone is quite that extreme, but it's easy for the stabilizer to get pulled back into the past and what they did or didn't do. It's also easy for them to get caught up by their ego's catastrophic thinking, and thinking about what if this terrible thing happens, what if that terrible thing happens. Of course, they're trying to prepare themselves so that they can deal with whatever might happen. But what they're doing is they're focusing on what's wrong. They're forecasting horrible things. They are staying in ego because the ego is taking us very often to the past or the future, and they're not in the present moment. So they're not really enjoying and able to access the greater wisdom of their higher essence. So they often focus on what's wrong rather than what's right. It's just, criticizing other people, criticizing themselves. They're usually very, very hard on themselves, very, 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 very hard on themselves. They often hold very strong convictions about what's right and what's wrong. Black and white thinking. I've had so many couples where often the couples that I used to see were stabilizers and improvisers hooked up together. And the stabilizer would have a hard time getting past a choice that the improviser wanted to make that was natural for the improviser and acceptable in the world. But from the stabilizer's perspective, it was just wrong. It was wrong because it's not the choice I would make. So it's the wrong choice. And to be right, you need to make the right choice, which is my choice. So that's a very stuck place to be. And that's the ego. That's absolutely the ego talking. So that's something else for stabilizers to work through. So what helps? They have a wonderful desire to be of service. Being of service is a wonderful pathway to essence. It's coming from the highest and the best within you when we're of service. And stabilizer preference people long to be of service and give so generously of themselves in the world in countless ways. And so I think those are very powerful positives that can assist them in moving towards essence, because they are kind of the Mother Teresa path to essence, being being there for others in these wonderful ways that make them feel good and certainly make the world a tremendously better place. Also, their willingness to commit to routines, because a lot of the pathways, and there are numerous pathways to being more in essence than ego, of course, but a lot of them involve doing something regularly. I mean, when you change your thinking regularly, you create new brain pathways. When you change your routines regularly, your active routines, by taking time to pray, or taking time to meditate, or taking time to be in nature on a regular basis, that's when you're going to get the most bang for your buck, so to speak. So that commitment to routines is a great thing. So what are their helpful resources? Mindfulness classes, first and foremost, because mindfulness classes, and they're available nowadays everywhere, I think, and they help stabilizer preference people to learn to focus in the now, to be the witness to their own thoughts, and realize you are not your thoughts, and you are not your thoughts, you're the witness to your thoughts, and your thoughts aren't necessarily true, not true about anything. They are just thoughts. So mindfulness classes are great. Also, learning self-compassion. Kristin Neff has done a fantastic job researching the power of self-compassion. We get caught up with self-esteem a long time ago in the 1960s and 1970s. Self-esteem was everything. Everybody needed self-esteem. And what we've discovered is self-esteem is about comparing yourself to other people. And of course, the ego is about comparing yourself to other people and either being better than or less than. And so it brings more ego, not less. The power, self-compassion actually helps people create more and better mental health. It has so many positive variables associated with it. The more self-compassionate we are, the happier we tend to be, the more successful we tend to be, the less depressed we tend to be, and the list goes on and on and on. So learning to be self-compassionate. And that means, rather than judging ourselves, to be gentle and loving with ourselves. And so Neff has some great processes for doing that, and all the research on her website. So I highly recommend that. And then Bruce Lipton, The Biology of Belief. Bruce Lipton is a cell biologist. Some of you may know his work as well. And a lot of times stabilizers have this focus on what's wrong with my body, what's wrong with my body. And Bruce Lipton gives a whole nother model for understanding how important your positive thinking is for affecting your biology, and that your biology is not, it's impacted by your thoughts in positive and negative ways. And so we have the ability to affect our biology by changing our patterns of thinking. And so it's a wonderful book and very, very uplifting. All right, moving right along. One of Kristin Neff's quotes: when we give ourselves compassion, we're opening our hearts in a way that can transform our lives. And it really does. Self-compassion is so transformative. And a beautiful part of moving to essence is becoming more self-compassionate. And then we have the theorist preference. And theorists can, as you probably know, get stuck in their heads. And essence is not about being stuck in your head. It's about embodying this consciousness. Consciousness is not just in our heads. Consciousness is in our bodies. It's about not thinking, but finding a place of knowing that is deeper than thinking. Now, there's nothing wrong with thinking, rational thinking. The ego also thinks, but the ego is irrational thinking very often. So it's not that thinking needs to go, and rational thinking can be very helpful. thinking through planning, organizing, all the things that we use our minds, our beautiful minds to do. But we want to open to a place of deeper knowing. And sometimes NT preference people can reject that just because it can't all be explained. We don't even have the language to explain a lot of this. So they can reject spirituality or moving towards essence because we don't have clear definitions or scientific research necessarily that proves that something is possible. And you have to be willing to be open to possibilities and suspend disbelief. You don't have to believe in order to move to essence, but you have to be willing to suspend disbelief to move towards essence. And there's a difference between the two. Be open to the possibility that something else might be there, that there's a deeper kind of knowing within you, that there's a higher place for you to be in your consciousness. And what are their preference pathways? Well, I love the intense curiosity of the NTs. They are willing to ask really big questions, and they will consider new models. And if the model makes sense to them, they'll embrace it. So if they are open to being curious and open to asking questions and open to considering new models, those can serve them very well in their movement from ego to essence. I also appreciate the theorist's ability to be emotionally detached from ideas. Some of the rest of us, self included, get really emotionally attached to our ideas. And so we have a hard time seeing things from a different perspective, because basically it's kind of giving credence to the other side, so to speak. And we want to be right, and that's the ego. And I have witnessed many theorist preference people who have this wonderful ability to take criticisms, take a completely different way of looking at a situation, and really be willing to entertain it and even embrace it if it makes sense. I think that's a real strength that they have when it comes to spiritual growth. So some helpful resources. Nassim Haramein is the first one that comes to mind. He is a quantum physicist. He has founded the Resonance Science Foundation, and they are quite amazing. He has come up with something called unified field theory. I don't think he has any training in physics. That's what's really interesting, but he's quite the genius. I think a theorist himself, and he has a way of putting things together that bridges science and spirituality like nothing I've seen before. Fascinating work. And I think a theorist might really get into his work and see possibilities there that they haven't seen before. He's kind of validating in some ways with his research a lot of the old spiritual teachings and saying, well, this makes sense now because this is what we know about quantum physics. And so actually, the idea that there really is no time, it really makes sense when you look at it through the lens of unified field theory, for example. And not one of my favorite quotes from him is, looking for consciousness in the brain is the equivalent of looking for the announcer in your radio. Isn't that a great quote? Love that. David Hawkins is another guy who's deceased, but he's written a lot of books. And one of his books was Power versus Force, where he basically mapped out all consciousness. A fascinating book. And I think he too was a theorist. And I think theorists might really enjoy his work if they haven't found it. And then the HeartMath Foundation is doing wonderful research in spirituality and science and the heart, and making some fascinating discoveries about how the heart operates. The heart sends more messages to the brain than the brain does to the heart, actually. When our hearts are in a state of what they call coherence, it affects our biology throughout our body. It's kind of like the central point, and what happens in the heart affects outward every part of us. So it's a wonderful organization and doing some fantastic work. So Albert Einstein said, "I never made any of my discoveries through the process of rational thinking." He went, I'm sure, to a place of essence to make those discoveries. Isn't that a great picture of Albert? All right, lastly, looks like we're not going to have time to have our small groups, but I want to talk about the improvisers. Improvisers are SP preferences, of course, and one of their pitfalls is they get easily bored. They crave stimulation, especially in today's world where a lot of people are used to enormous amounts of stimulation. Even when we're watching a movie, things are shifting again and again and again so quickly. And this can get in the way of spiritual development. And I'm sorry if you hear that. The trash people are here early today, apparently. So you're getting to hear the trash people out on our street, but they should be through pretty quickly. And then they focus on, sometimes they can get kind of diverted from working on their own spiritual growth to focusing on gaining psychic powers, which is the ego, of course. So, and there's nothing wrong with people who have psychic powers, of course, but when that's your focus, gaining that rather than growing spiritually, sometimes that can get you in trouble. And it's certainly not moving to essence. It's not going to be about spiritual growth in that case. And lastly, their desire to impress can get in the way because the ego really wants to impress. The ego wants to be better than, and the ego has a desire to impress people with how spiritual they are, for example. Other types can do this too, but the SP in particular might want to demonstrate and prove how very spiritual they are, which is totally the ego coming through the back door again. So something else to think about. And the improvisers' pathways are, who else lives in the now? I mean, oh my goodness, living in the now, being optimistic, letting go of the past so easily. I have a little story about this. I have a brother who's an ISFP preference person, ISFP. He builds swimming pools. He builds really expensive swimming pools. Right now he's working at Michael Jackson's own old ranch and redoing all the swimming pools there. And he got sued, and he lost the suit because he broke some rules. Okay, he started building a pool before he kind of finished getting his contractor's license. But he built a beautiful pool. They couldn't deny that. But anyhow, so he lost it, and he got his contractor's license in the interim. And 3 days after he lost this big lawsuit, and he lost over $200,000. I mean, it was a lot of money, and he doesn't have that much money to be able to say, yeah, I'll let it go, $200,000. I don't know how much that is in pounds, but it's a lot of money. And 2 days later was his birthday, and I called him on his birthday, and I expected him to be lamenting, that he lost and everything. And I said, "Hi, Ken, how are you doing?" And he said, "Fantastic. I've never been better." And I said, "Oh yeah, tell me more." And he said, "Oh, I'm so blessed, and my life is so wonderful." And and truly, he has a wonderful life and many, many fantastic things going on in his life. And he listed some of them. And then I thought, I'm just going to mention this and just see, you know, maybe I got the wrong information. So I said, you know, what about that lawsuit? And he said, oh, that. And this is what he literally said. Oh, that was 2 days ago. And he said, you know, if you dwell on that stuff, it just brings you down, really. And I'll just deal with it. I'll just deal with it. I have to deal with it. I'm going to deal with it, learn from it. And, you know, today is a beautiful day. Is that optimism? Is that living in the now? That's the pathway to essence, I'll tell you. Being able to do that, and here is this improviser doing that oh so naturally. And then their connection to the natural world is also a gift and certainly can be a pathway for them. Not that others can't be connected to the natural world, but so many, especially the ISFPs, are very connected to the natural world. So what are some helpful resources for them? Well, listening to The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, not reading it. A lot of times my improviser clients won't read, but they, not some of them will, but the ones that won't, absolutely won't. It's boring to them, but they'll listen. And The Power of Now is best to be listened to, that fabulous book by Eckhart Tolle. And doing things like yoga and chanting and drumming are all other pathways that they can really appreciate that are more active. And then I've known a lot of improvisers to get very interested in indigenous people's traditions that somehow grabs them and adds color and flavor to and interest to this movement from ego to essence. So I love this quote by John Muir, this guy from Scotland who founded the Sierra Club. Clearest way into the universe is through a forest wilderness. He has so many beautiful quotes, and he absolutely embodied essence. And his pathway was by going into the forest, the mountains, for months at a time by himself. And he said he would find a plant that he'd never seen before, and he would sit and get to know the plant for 24 hours. I mean, just an amazing, amazing human being with much to teach the rest of us. So I wanted to mention, I have a slide that you'll see that I have groups, spiritual growth groups and classes, and you can go to transformationu.net and find out more about those. And I have a final quote for you before I call for questions. And that is a quote by Rumi that I love. You're not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop. Isn't that beautiful? So I'm wondering if we have any questions. I've gone through a lot of stuff, a lot of material here and in a short time. And so I could stop sharing.
Eve.
Yes. I can't hear you now, Viv.
Excuse me again.
Whoops.
Hiya. As a contrast, I'm just curious to know, had you phoned your brother 2 days before or on the day of his lawsuit, where would he have been in that space, right, really in the moment?
You know, it's very quick, I found with him, that he gets over things very quickly. So I think maybe as it's happening, certainly he's going to be disappointed, but he very quickly moves on and he doesn't resist. He doesn't know this can't happen. The rest of us can be in resistance a lot, I think. This shouldn't happen to me. We'll go into feeling like victims. Why is the world against me? I can't believe this, et cetera, et cetera. He doesn't do any of that. He doesn't do any of that. So, and I've met other improvisers who are just like that as well. And I think that's just something I try to emulate as much as possible. Great question, Viv, thanks. Okay, other questions? Let me see. I'm going to see if I can stop sharing my screen and then I can see all of you. let's see. View. Gallery view. Here we go. Oh my. Hello, everybody. So other questions, or Richard, were there other questions that were written that you picked up on, themes or questions?
There's more a bit of chat going on and throughout. It inspired a lot of thought and insights that people kind of came. So it's quite interesting seeing the parallel sort of thread of the chat, that as you were talking and people kind of had thoughts from it. I don't know if there's any specific questions though that I can see. But yeah, if anyone wants to, could raise a hand using the virtual blue hand thing in the participant menu, or...
So it's Sweeve, another question for me then, if I'll jump in, if that's okay. Do you find, I know you've covered each of the 4 temperaments, do you find any of the temperaments get more stuck than any of the others? In my head, I've got the vision of the stabilizers because they spend so much time in the past. But do you find any get more stuck than others, or are they kind of all equal in your experience?
More stuck in what way?
Letting go of the ego, but sort of being more and more entrenched by the ego and not finding their way through the pathway because they've drawn backwards so often. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that. What do the rest of you think? Does anybody have any thought about that? Because that is true. They get entrenched, but others have other ways of being stuck. Spiritual bypass is stuckness, you know. Their addictions are a way of being stuck in the ego, and you know, all of the temperaments can engage in addictions of various kinds. We find different kinds, but
yeah, that's really interesting. Addictions. Thank you.
yeah.
Eve, we've got a couple of questions. Linda Behrens has got a hand up, and then we've got one from Megan Volta. Sorry, Love Volta.
Oh, there's Linda way in the corner up there. Hi, Linda. Oh, I can't hear you. Are you unmuted? You're still muted, Linda.
Okay, it wasn't working. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about stabilizers getting more stuck than others. One of the things in my ripe old age, I've discovered that both my husband and I, INTP preferences, have an inner stabilizer. So we especially with COVID, there's a whole lot of fear about what's going to happen, et cetera, so there are a couple of things. One is that with that type development comes a downside as well as a good side, a positive side, and also that the external conditions like COVID, all kinds of other things, you know, traumas you had as a child, are going to make a big difference. So, and I have seen improvisers. Most recently, I had like 5 improvisers in one of my courses, which was like rare.
Wow.
And it was like just seeing just a whole different side of people with that preference. That much more developed than I had learned back in the day when I learned temperament.
Mm-hmm.
You know, much more on the spiritual side. Like one person is writing a book on power and love.
Wow.
Yeah. So just note, think that we have some stereotypes about stabilizer and improviser that we need to lose.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And expand. Maybe the thing would be to expand. Expand.
Yeah. I think we do. I think we do have some limiting perspectives on stabilizers and improvisers that are simply not true. Yeah.
And I have an addiction to chocolate, so.
Okay.
And carbs.
Well, at least you've chosen some very good addictions. I highly approve. And remember in all of this to be light and generous with yourself. generous hearted with yourself. I think that we're just taught to be so judgmental of ourselves and so hard on ourselves, so much self-recrimination, so much, pushing ourselves, thinking that, and beating ourselves up when we're not who we think we should be. And I see that with all of the temperaments to a certain extent. And I think that it's really, really important, if there's one thing that you take away from this, that we are loving to ourselves, that we are kind and compassionate with ourselves. I've gotten to where I literally, when I am being hard on myself and I catch myself, I literally put my hands on my heart and talk to myself in a loving and compassionate way. And I find putting that hands on my heart makes a big difference. It feels like I really am talking to me. And I've found that doing that and really focusing on self-compassion and lightheartedness, being able to laugh at our foibles and our ego, and realizing we're all dealing with this very challenging human condition that we were born into. It's just not easy being human, and we all do the best we can. And it's not about being perfect. It's not about needing to get somewhere. It's not about being totally evolved and only coming from essence, as all of you know. It's about really enjoying the journey and doing the best we can and being gentle with ourselves and with other people, loving ourselves as much as we can, even loving our foibles, loving the parts of us that have gotten us in trouble, loving the parts of us that have made the worst choices, loving the parts of us that have been stuck, and just being okay with all of that. And as we do that, we're coming from essence as well, believe it or not. Now, the ego's never going to suggest that. The ego says, no, we must be harder on ourselves. We must wag that finger and criticize ourselves because it's not okay to be this way. You shouldn't be making these mistakes again and again. You shouldn't be whatever we tell ourselves. And that's just simply not true. So I think that conquering or having the ego less controlling of us means lightening up, loving ourselves, being compassionate with ourselves, and being okay with where we're at without thinking we need to accomplish something more or be something different. Who you are is so unique in all the universe. It's perfect. It's absolutely perfect. And you're not here to be some model example of spiritual evolution. You're not here for that. You're here to enjoy the ride, I think. So that's my philosophy. And the more I honor that, the better I feel and the better my life goes. And the more I think mentally healthy I am. And the more joyful life is. And it's not that I honor that all the time, but I certainly try to as much as possible. So I'll get off my soapbox here. Any other questions?
Yeah, Eve, there was one, just maybe have time for the last one. It was from Megan, and she said, do you think that different spiritual beliefs or schools of thought are more aligned with certain temperaments?
Wow, that's a great question, Megan. And I don't know, but I bet they are. I bet they are. That is probably a great thing to do research on. Because it makes sense that some would speak to some of us more than others of us, some different spiritual traditions or approaches.
It's an interesting book, actually. I just pulled this off my shelf. I happen to own this book. It's hard to see it, actually. It's called Four Spiritualities by a guy called Peter Tufts Richardson, and it's actually about the functional pairings like the NT, NF, ST, SF, and he talks about these four different kind of ways that they express spirituality. So there's an interesting book. If anyone.
Wow. What's the author's last name again?
Richardson.
Richardson. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Four Spiritualities.
Four Spiritualities, and yeah, it's quite interesting. There you go.
All right. Well, I want to say thank you to all of you for being here. It's wonderful, wonderful to have you here. And I look forward to the rest of the conference and hearing some of you speak or watching the ones that I didn't get to see today on the recordings. So thank you, everyone. And thank you, Richard. Thank you for hosting.
Thank you. It's been really interesting. It's a lovely way to end the first day of this conference. We've got 3 more days as well. It's going to be amazing.
Okay, great.
Exhausted. If anyone wants to now, though, we go back to the Type Lounge. It's a Kumo space. I don't know if any of you have not been in there yet, but it's worth exploring. It's a great way to kind of network and chat as if you're kind of in a real physical space, but it's a lot closer to that than the breakout rooms and things. You can wander around this virtual room and the various rooms, and literally, if you're in a within range of this kind of area that's a lighter area around your avatar, then you can actually chat to people in real time in audio. Huh. I'd recommend that now. Like, that's going to be open now. I'd say if anyone wants to grab a real drink and join us there, we half an hour of that for networking now. In the Type Lounge, you can find it in the conference portal. You go right at the top, there's a link to the Type Lounge. It's very easy, click in there. You don't need an account. You just go in and wander around with the arrow keys or the mouse and chat.
All right. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks a lot, Eve.
All right. Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Eve. Bye-bye.
You're welcome. Bye.